privilege to be the director of the Logan Center for the Arts, and on behalf of all of the sponsors of today's conference and last night's film screening, we're just thrilled to welcome you here, and thank you for coming out on such a gorgeous and beautiful and sunny day. But I can't imagine a better reason to be inside on a day like this than to celebrate and think about someone who brought so much light as Sun Ra did. So it's great to have you here. This program is sponsored by not only the Logan Center for the Arts, but also the Franke Institute for the Humanities, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Department of Music's Julian Parker Hall Endowment for Jazz and American Popular Music, and the Deputy Provost for the Arts, and we certainly appreciate to them for all their funding. I also just want to, before diving in, thank just a couple of other groups. There's a group of folks that have been pulling this all together. Tracy and Dara from the Center for Race, Politics, and Culture, Summer and Kate and Chris from the Logan Center, and of course the other Logan Center staff who make this all happen. So I invite us all to give a round of applause to them for pulling that, providing all the logistical support. And the other major thank you is to David Boykin, who we were thrilled to have in residence through our Arts and Public Life and Center for Study of Race, Politics, and Culture residency program in 2013, who is himself a spectacular composer and saxophonist and band leader, but who has been an incredible advocate for understanding and remembering the power of Sun Ra. And he approached us about a year ago, David, something like that. And first with a concept, I hope you were all there, this was maybe 2 years ago, to celebrate his birthday with 100 saxophones in Washington Park. And then excited to bring this moment together, both with the conversations and presentations that you'll hear this afternoon, and then we certainly hope you'll stay throughout the day and the evening for a terrific concert in the Performance Hall, which David has put together. David is going to say more, but let me introduce him by saying that he began studying music at the age of 21 and began performing professionally in 1997. Since then, he's released 16 recordings as a leader, appeared as a featured guest in other prominent musicians' recordings, and performed at international jazz festivals and smaller jazz venues, both locally and globally, including the Moscow Jazz Festival, a blues festival in Paris that I'm not going to murder the name of, and the Chicago Jazz Festival, and the Lublin Jazz Festival in Lublin, Poland, and the Vision Festival in New York City. In 2005, he founded the Sonic Youth Ministries, an organization dedicated to the spiritual evolution of humanity through music, and we are so thrilled that he brought that experience both to the Arts Incubator and Arts and Public Life in the Logan Center and is here again with us helping present this conference. Thank you again so much for being here, and it's now my pleasure to introduce David Boykin, a spectacular musician and colleague, to start us off. Thanks again.
Thank you all for being here. There's a couple of people I also wanted to thank that were at some of the initial meetings and stages and planning of this. Was Travis Jackson, Melvin Butler, I don't know if you mentioned Mitchell Marr as well. And most importantly, at the time when I was resident artist, and I proposed the idea of the 100 saxophones for Sun Ra, Ravana Popov, she was a dean of students, and she really planted the seed that, oh well, it shouldn't just be just as 100 saxophones, there should be like a complete conference, you know, dealing with Sun Ra. But it was an issue with time in terms of completing that before the residency was over, so conversations continued, and thus we're here today. My own personal, I guess, feelings, exploration about Sun Ra, coming to music and being attracted to his music and fascinated by his music and then his ideas and philosophies, and researching and studying and first just listening to his music and then like reading more about him in the literature and scholarly works written about him and magazine articles. I felt that that there were some things in his work that weren't being addressed or being explored as much as they could be that parallel with the ideas of the Black resistance movement. I felt like I saw ideas of like nationalism, separatism, and cultural nationalism. And he would always make these, he would occasionally make statements that were very controversial regarding race, regarding politics. And I felt that a lot of these statements would just be said and they would not be followed up by many of the writers, researchers, interviewers. So I felt that this was an area that needed to be further investigated because it was where my interest myself lied. And in a master's program, I wrote a paper on Sun Ra dealing with the topic. And then I felt like, wow, you know, there really needs to be a lot more done by some people a lot more intelligent than me. So I invited, you know, these people here to explore some of those ideas today. And the first one of which is our keynote, Thomas Stanley. And I became aware of Thomas Stanley through bass player Luke Stewart. He was here in Chicago performing with William Hooker. And I had met him previously online, meet a lot of musicians online, exchange a lot online. And we were talking, and Sun Ra came up, and he was like, well, have you read The Execution of Sun Ra by Thomas Stanley? I was like, no. You know, and he gave me a copy of the book, and he's a good friend of Thomas's, and that's how we met. And I found his work and his approach to Sun Ra different, you know, from everything else that I had read, in the sense that everything else was really strictly pretty much like autobiographical, right? Not autobiographical, just this happened, this date, and when. But his was much more of an analysis of Sun Ra's like thoughts and perspectives and philosophies. And I appreciated, you know, that about his work. So let me tell you a little more about Thomas Stanley. He has recently completed a 12-year run at George Mason University, where he's been assistant professor of sound art and consciousness in the School of Art. His doctoral work examined Butch Morris's Art of Conduction as an extended meta-instrument, offering unique opportunities for music pedagogy and ensemble consciousness. He is co-author of George Clinton and P-Funk, An Oral History, and has written and lectured extensively on emerging musical cultures. As an artist, performer, and curator, Stanley has been an integral part of a vibrant experimental music scene along the Baltimore-Washington corridor. His work attempts to exploit the capacity of sound and music for anchoring, framing, and energizing our subjective experience of macro-temporal texture. Currently, with the trio Mind Over Matter, Music Over Mind, he constructs and deploys sampled and electronically generated music. Thomas Stanley is a founding member of Transparent Productions, a nonprofit volunteer collective that has produced nearly 300 improvised jazz and experimental music concerts throughout the DC metro area since 1997. His most recent project, The Execution of Sun Ra, is a critical response to the philosophical contributions of the late jazz oracle. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Stanley.
Hotep. Free the land. Emancipate the waters. And liberate the sky. I'm going to repeat some thank yous because I'm very glad to be here. I think this is important work, and everybody has pulled together in a really strong way to make sure that this event is substantive and not just enjoyable. I want to specifically thank Dara Epson. Dara has done an incredible job. David, of course, for the invitation. I can't say enough about my buddy Luke Stewart. Don't want to say too much. Don't want to lose this one to Gotham City, Greg. But he's an incredible musician. Keep your eyes and ears open for Luke Stewart. He's a bass player, multi-instrumentalist, and a really incredible human being, an asset. William Hooker created the situation when David and Luke got to play together, and wouldn't have been possible without him. So everything kind of works in the same direction. I'm going to play around with this until I get it the way I'm comfortable with it. All right, that'll work, that'll work, that'll work. your time is sacred. And the fact that you've chosen to spend your time with me, I take that as really, really important. I want to be provocative, but I didn't come just to stir you up. So I'm going to do what I came to do, and we've got all sorts of really brilliant people here that have studied Sun Ra, his work, his legacy. And I hope that all of it will come together in a way that leaves you better prepared to act in what I think is a very challenging time, but also a time with very distinct promises. I have to admit that I've been asked to speak today about Sun Ra in a way that is not my first, second, or third choice as far as angles of approach to this great, great being and his enormous body of work. Strictly speaking, black resistance is a political topic, and Sun Ra was not a political figure, even though he lived during a time when the walls between cultural and political work had been thoroughly dismantled, a time when John Lennon was being harassed by the FBI and Marvin Gaye was using Motown as a platform for pre-rap urban manifestos. And even though we are acutely aware that Sun Ra's life intersected a period in American history where political power had temporarily spilled out of its hegemonic institutions and into the streets, we have to admit that we find in Ra's words and actions a profile of political values that is at times frustratingly opaque, at times embarrassingly underwhelming. Remember, for example, that when asked how he voted, the ever-contrary Sun Ra boasted Republican, of course. When asked why, he told us that the world needed folks in power who understood duplicity, and that the GOP certainly excelled in that department. Sun Ra appeared to go through all manner of conniptions and contortions to avoid being overtly political. We know that he stridently rejected the very phraseology by which the pro-black and anti-war movements of his time defined their goals and core values. Words like freedom, equality, and peace, Sun Ra would characteristically deconstruct with his semantic equations as false values, traps, and not the self-evident ideals that most believe them to be. So we must, I think, be very, very careful about what we think we can say concerning Sun Ra and black or any other kind of political resistance. Several years ago, I developed and taught a graduate seminar on resistance and sound. We learned that the idea of resistance is grounded in the ability to say no. That is, no to the agency of the self being absorbed into, dissolved by, or smothered under the agency of the other. We learned that there is great power in the ownership of the word no and its decisive utilization. Now, as Sun Ra was modeling resistance, then we must be very certain at whom and what he was aiming his unique life of refusal. Before we go any further, let's establish some basic facts about the subject of our discussion, specifically Sun Ra and the role of his myth science in black resistance. We have to first concede that Sun Ra is a vast cultural object and an enigmatic singularity occupying a distinctive place not just within the storied halls of black culture or jazz culture, but earth culture. Sun Ra was his own genre of everything. He lived a life of self-determination and determined himself to be another order of being, a member of an angel race. At the core of this odd life is a body of valuable music, thousands of hours performed publicly or recorded for mass release, and countless charts and alternate arrangements left with the men he coached through innumerable cumulative years of mostly private rehearsals in the crowded living room of a North Philadelphia row house, or the largest room of any of the other humble dwellings that Sun Ra used as the base for his earthly operations. But his prolific life as a musician, we are to understand as merely the perfect carrier wave, a well-adapted supporting vocation for his real work, which was a multi-decade project that had to do with human beings and time, specifically human development. The execution of Sun Ra was written out of a bizarre and very personal crisis of necessity. After I met Ra in the late 80s, my own life gradually devolved into a continual, subterranean active meditation on Ra's life and teachings. And there was, on the day that I started writing, an irresistible fear of leaving the planet without doing something concrete, public, maybe even useful, with all those hours and days spent thinking about Sun Ra. My work is the way it is, largely because Sun Ra is the way he is. In spite of, or maybe because of, the large volume of accessible documents of what Sun Ra had to say about almost anything that one could have something to say about, it is very difficult to render the essential features of his thought as simply the logical distillation of careful and comprehensive textual analysis. Sun Ra is the cultural anomaly, the rare historical enigma that exceeds itself. Sun Ra is far more than what he said, performed, or lived. He is, and even after careful study and analysis, remains a bouquet of paradoxes, raging opposites, tenuously co-joined like the same poles of a magnet forced together, but opposites. Dig? Sun Ra, the flamboyant, comedic space-suit attired musician who toured the world, starred in movies, released a blizzard of recordings, and never met a microphone that he didn't absolutely love, could look you dead in the eye and with a hushed voice insist that he was trying to keep a low profile. I've heard Sun Ra in one sentence vigorously and categorically assert that he was not a leader, and with almost the next breath ruthlessly chastise black people for, among other failings, not accepting his leadership. Sun Ra performed a life of asexuality and familial disengagement, and yet he was one of the most procreative forces in black culture and was, for his orchestra, tribe, clan, ashram, a very real source of both motherly and fatherly love. Yes, I witnessed all that tender compassion leaking out from around his veneer of mythic bombast, and that's a paradox too. Sun Ra talked a lot, a whole lot, and there was usually somebody standing nearby with a tape recorder. In researching and developing the execution, I was confronted with a poverty of riches, a colossal heap of primary and secondary sources that Sun Ra had quite deliberately left behind as both a pirate's mapping of the path to buried treasure and an inscrutable time capsule containing a mangled mishmash of mysterious relics and out-of-place artifacts. My experience of sifting through my subset of the enormous volume of words left by Sun Ra was often like finding needles in a haystack, using the most sensitive parts of my body to discover the most incendiary truths. One thing I can say with some certainty is that Sun Ra only appeared to be working in his time, but was actually creating something like an instrument, an appliance, a device that would only realize its full potential long after he had left the planet. Sun Ra could say wise things, and Sun Ra could say silly things, and Sun Ra could say things that if anybody had bothered to take him seriously, could have only been considered blasphemous and treasonous in the extreme. I believe, as I've said already, that Sun Ra was a singularity, a force in human affairs that has no contemporary parallel. His unique function and ontology were a product of Sun Ra's own intelligence and agency, but, and this is crucial, were just as much a reflection of Ra's willingness to yield to the call of the omniverse and allow his unique energy and gifts to meld with the vast intelligence of what some have begun to call the Akashic field. That is, Sun Ra, the invincible iconoclast, was very much a product of surrender. Now, if we stipulate that Robert Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project represents both the crowning achievement of white power and a project to potentially end all time, then Sun Ra's work among us can operationally be cast as Oppenheimer's antithesis, the supreme black power time bomb. We know that prototypes for a super weapon with the capacity to annihilate at the deepest level of existence were only tested in the field twice, and that the subjects in both of these demonstrations/experiments were non-white human beings. We know that there was no military necessity for the attacks on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and we know that this experiment was a success. You really can vaporize human beings, tens of thousands at a time, in an instant. Job well done, boys. Thanks for all the hard work, said Bobby O. We know that Uncle Sam is the father of the idea of our planet, perpetually poised in the jaws of nuclear destruction. That ain't a black idea. When I say that Ra is a black power time bomb, I mean not just in the typical sense of an IED with a little red LCD timer on it, the kind that has driven the plot line of so many tired action movies. I do not mean simply that the Ra bomb is an activity whose consequences are deferred. No, I mean quite specifically and literally that Sun Ra is a bomb, the explosive charge of which is the alchemical product of the dynamic tension of all those competing paradoxes, and that the detonation of the Ra bomb generates new time. His is a psychocultural ordinance whose blast yields neither shrapnel nor nuclear wind, but rather minutes and seconds, months and years. That is fresh temporal space, presumably to fill with something like a fresh history. And that's a pretty neat trick, but also a very necessary counterforce to the nuclear ambitions that have held the Earth hostage for 70 years, all of my life, really. It is a bit ridiculous to think that Iran's nuclear program should be so controversial when its regional neighbor Israel is permitted to have an undeclared nuclear arsenal that is beyond the reach of diplomacy or sanction, and yet, in light of Israel's avowed territorial objectives, must be seen as every bit a threat to stability and peace as the nuclear efforts of the Iranian Republic. I did a composition with my band, Mom Squared. We don't say all those words, David. Mind over matter, music over mind. We just say Mom Squared. Mom, acronym, squared, okay. We did a piece called Mordecai Vanunu. I thought everyone should know the name of the nuclear scientist who took the details of Israel's atomic weapons program to the press and was jailed for his courage, ostracized for his candor. Sun Ra did a piece called Hiroshima because Sun Ra did necessary things, and it was necessary for some great artists to address the horrific tragedy of this grotesque human sacrifice on the altar of manifest destiny. It is a towering, at times brooding, 14-minute solo pipe organ performance unlike anything else in Sun Ra's catalog. Sun Ra's organ of creation weeps the names of all of Hiroshima's dead, the incinerated, the irradiated, the wasted, and the lost, in much the way that Gretschke's Symphony No. 3, with its long, droning opening movement, memorializes the European dead of World War II. Ra's work begins in earnest at about the same time and place as the Manhattan Project, which was, and y'all should know this, actually launched beneath the stands of the original Stag Field football stadium, a short distance from where we are, right here on the campus of the University of Chicago. So understand that on December 2nd, 1942, Enrico Fermi triggers the first self-sustained nuclear chain reaction in history at a location that is about a brisk 10-minute walk from here, right up on, Ella Street. And understand that 6 days later, Sun Ra refuses to report for his service alternative to draft induction. Later that month, he is jailed, and by all accounts, the experience of being incarcerated for his resistance smolders within Sun Ra and catalyzes an even more profound sense of social alienation, eventually driving him out of the South. By the time Sun Ra arrives in Chicago in 1946, the Manhattan Project has already delivered a series of deployment-ready weapons and has moved on from uranium-fueled models like the one that obliterated Hiroshima to much more powerful plutonium-based bombs like the kind that was tested later that year at Bikini Atoll. Sun Ra was summoned forth as the last angel of history to put a stop to all of this profane carnage and wanton destruction. He didn't have a budget, a laboratory, fissionable material, cyclotrons, or centrifuges. He had musicians and intervals, and rhythms and tones, and a profoundly Hathor-like knowledge of how all these can be made to interact to alleviate the disease of history. Sifting through the archives of Ra's recorded testimony, I came across more than a few large and profoundly challenging statements. For instance, Sun Ra often complained that human beings are slowing down. His assessment would, at face value, appear to contradict the common understanding that thanks to technology, there has been in the last 100 years a great acceleration of every mode of communication and transportation. In fact, the story of the 20th century, Sun Ra's century, might be told by some as the story of stamped postal letters being replaced by email and text messaging, or of biplanes yielding to space shuttles and communication satellites. Everything around us has gotten much faster, but what about the human being at the center of all this rushing mechanism? Sun Ra was quite capable of offering from his self-assumed throne of judgment an emperor's new clothes critique of a species so quick to define its progress in terms of the sophistication of its toys and tools, rather than the refinement of the cultural machinery by which the collective is mobilized and coordinated. This idea of retarded and misevaluated development is central to our discussion of myth, science, and resistance. Retarded here is used very carefully and precisely to indicate a misalignment between expectations inherent in certain developmental mileposts and actual outcome. Let's be blunt without offending anyone. If your 4-month-old baby coos and purrs as her primary form of vocalization, it's the cutest thing in the world. If the vocal repertoire of the same child is pretty much unchanged at the age of 4 years, you've already sought expert clinical help from developmental specialists and are in the midst of one of the most difficult journeys that any parent can face. Sun Ra aggressively reminds us that from the vantage point of any reasonable standard, the evolution of intelligent life on this planet is pathologically stalled. And since this truncated condition is in many ways self-inflicted, Sun Ra's diagnosis is wrapped in a certain amount of scorn. Slowing down. Yeah, slowing down. Let's do, please, a little thought experiment to show you what Sun Ra might have meant by human deceleration. I'll need to do this a couple of times before I get through it. Stand with me, please, in my bedroom in 1975. It's summertime, and I can get away with having the windows open because it's hot outside, and the small lizards that I keep as pets and let roam free in the pleats of my drapes are a little funky. Everybody in the house appreciates the breeze. Plus, I can blow bong hits out the window without getting busted. All right, had to get that in there. My little plastic Panasonic cassette radio turntable, all-in-one medium-fi unit, is doing as much as it can with its 30 watts. Whatever's on my turntable, and it might be P-Funk, might be Black Sabbath, it might be Jimi Hendrix, Sly Stone, or the Ohio Players, Mandrill, or anybody else with lots of bass and plenty of guitar. Whatever it is, it will eventually get loud enough to draw my father past the incense and lizard poop and into my room, and you should now, in the imaginary space of this thought experiment, listen with me as my angry father loudly berates my favorite tunes for being so different from the music of his youth. To prove his point, he needed only take me back 20 years or so to crooners like Billy Eckstine and Arthur Prysock, or 30 years back to the reign of the big band royalty, my pop's favorite, Lunsford and Basie. Many years later, as an ethnomusicologist, I would be able to speak clearly and extensively to the structural, organological, and contextual contrasts that really do make the music of my youth so radically different from my father's sound world. Now, here's the experimental part of our little thought experiment. We're now going to leave my high school bedroom and fast forward some 40 years. That's 4 decades. Stand with me in the near present in my 8-year-old son's bedroom. We're looking over his shoulder at a YouTube clip playing on his tablet. It's by an artist named Bruno Mars. And it's got a squeaky clean, sort of corny vocal hook. But I'm relieved that it's not another racy hip-hop drug anthem like I'm in love with the Coco, which is one of his all-time favorites. Yeah, I'm not the best dad in the world. I hadn't really been paying much attention to Mr. Mars and his work. I had seen him once as a halftime performer on a Super Bowl broadcast and was then only impressed by how conspicuously he had grafted his musical persona from unadulterated slices of Michael Jackson, Little Richard, and James Brown. Okay, but beyond the optics, listen with me to the song playing on my kid's tablet in 2015. In terms of its structure and instrumentation, it is hardly a contemporary song. It is not modern music. Mr. Mars' MTV featured video might have high production values, but I doubt that his music would have been competitive against the power hitters of 1970s black dance music. However, like so much of the music on my little boy's playlist, its basic sound format could have easily slipped into radio rotation in 1975 without so much as the blink of an eye. 40 years. We didn't know, did we, when the plans for this conference were coming together, that the national focus would be gripped by a new reality TV show, a franchise really, that isn't owned by any single network and can be viewed on demand across any number of platforms. This new reality show has two primary components, two principal participants, one or more law enforcement officer, and at least one dead black guy. If you have, as I have, begun work on your second half century, then this new reality show might leave you with a sickening sense of deja vu, coupled with the embarrassment of such obviously unfinished work. And you might have found yourself at least once over the course of the past 9 months screaming at the top of your lungs, no fucking way are we still talking about cops murdering black people in the second decade of the 21st century. No, really, why are people going so slow? Sun Ra was a very intriguing person, and even in absence, remains a very charismatic presence. Everybody whose cause is in some way propped up by the rhetoric of extreme creativity and visionary thought will at some point try to find some shade under the Ra tree. The reality is there ain't no shade under that tree, and Ra's influence is as disruptive and disturbing as it is anything else. His residue is a sticky, paradigm-busting gum left in the creases of his music, the deep pockets of his poetic parables. If you're going to approach what Sun Ra has to offer, you're going to change. Everything is going to change. Under a Sun Ra refreshing of our political thought, we will have to start thinking of our leaders more as contractors and less as heroes. I understand fully why we would be inclined to lionize and celebrate our Malcolms and Martins, our Fannie Lou's, our Assadas. These and many others are genuinely heroic people. They served their time nobly. But I think we are dead wrong to try to overemphasize the continuity of our struggle by calling for a resumption today of tactics that by all indications did not work then. Al Sharpton is still talking about let's march. I'm gonna march, I'm gonna march. That's his response to everything. It's tired, it doesn't sound credible anymore. Contractors do a job. They do it on schedule. They do it to standard. They're always a little off. If they're more than a little off, you fire them and get somebody else. I will not embrace a dogma of multi-generational struggle. This shit should be over by now. With acknowledged gratitude for a whole lot of hard work and sacrifice done on my behalf by people who came before me, I have an opportunity to stand in the present with a level of optimistic determinism that has not existed for any prior generation of black people. And I have no intention of bequeathing anything like a legacy of protracted struggle to my kids and my grandkids. Sun Ra was strategically apolitical and paradoxically distant from the points of consensus that define black power as a social movement. Did you hear that? I'll repeat it. Sun Ra was strategically apolitical and paradoxically distant from the points of consensus that define black power as a social movement. You cannot honestly or effectively turn Sun Ra's various pronouncements and equations into a prescriptive doctrine for black liberation or any other kind of social change. Unlike the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, as an example, whose books and lectures encompass the whole range of domestic and social affairs for his followers, whose Eat to Live went so far as to list the specific legumes and vegetables most optimal to a Muslim diet. Sun Ra was a devout generalist. Ra spoke boldly about great change, but did so in very vague terms. He did say turn or burn, but he didn't exactly say in which direction. It was never his mission to endorse an alternative ethic, code of conduct, or social program. He described himself as a catalyst. We can say he was a developmental catalyst. Sun Ra used to say that he was the only drug that we would ever need. I think he meant that literally. You see, I've come to think of Sun Ra as a psychedelic compound applied not to the individual central nervous system and the consciousness it supports, but rather something like subjecting the entire cultural symbolic system and the collective mind that it supports to a decades-long ayahuasca ceremony. As manifestly weird as Sun Ra was in most of his thought and much of his behavior, Sun Ra the man exuded a down-home, earthy, pre-integration black authenticity that often made me think of the courage and resilience of my grandparents. He was down in an unpretentious way that never retreated from the mannerisms of his poor southern earthly origins. His relationship with the black audience, however, was complex. The allusions to Africa and ancient Egypt made him naturally attractive to cultural nationalists. I was Minister of Information for the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa from 1985 until 1989. I worked closely with Amari Obadele, one of the most underappreciated political theorists of our time, and Chokwe Lumumba, who tragically died of a heart attack last year, shortly after being elected mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. One of my last official acts was the issuance of a new African People's Proclamation declaring Sun Ra a national treasure of the black nation in North America. While he famously helped Amiri Baraka launch the Black Arts Movement with a costume musical procession through the streets of Harlem, Sun Ra had no long-standing affiliations with any of the organized forces of black struggle. At Festac, he was not permitted to participate in the closing ceremonies because he refused to join the other attendees in a raised fist Black Power salute. Also, while in Nigeria, Danny Ray Thompson tells us that Sun Ra cautioned his band members to keep their distance from Fela Kuti and his shrine, because Fela was, as Sun Ra said, too hot at the time, meaning that Sun Ra knew that some type of police action involving the Nigerian superstar was always a possibility, and that that risk was not in Sun Ra's interest. As far as what we can infer about the political values of a self-consciously apolitical man, I think Danny summed it up best at an artist talk we had as part of our Washington, D.C. Sun Ra centenary. One of the audience members asked a question about Sun Ra's relationship to the politics of protest that defined the 60s and 70s, to which Danny responded, well, Sun Ra wasn't really no kind of power to the people sort of guy. That's an understatement. Sun Ra meticulously avoided the rhetoric of massism and equality, preferring instead to talk of processes anchored in the individual. When asked about the notion of equality in the manner of a true bodhisattva, Sun Ra directed the questioner to a nearby tree and asked him to bring 2 equal leaves. Of course, this is an impossible task. No two things in nature are identical. The point is that while Sun Ra, as band leader, could certainly appreciate the orchestral possibilities of well-shaped ensemble voicings, he was also at root a loner and an outsider, going back to his days as a teenager walking the streets of Birmingham in sandals and a toga, offering unsolicited biblical interpretations to anyone who passed by. Sun Ra understood the power of the human individual in a way that can only be paid lip service by liberal democracy. Rather than championing people power, he bemoaned the malign position of leaders. This is of particular concern to Sun Ra when talking of cultural leadership. Sun Ra lambasted the black press and the black record-buying public for refusing to recognize the value of its avant-garde artists. In general, Sun Ra might be seen as taking to task on many levels the social and aesthetic conservatism that are at times identified as the cornerstones of Black American identity. There are credible stories told by orchestra members of violent rejection by Black working class audiences who thought they were going to hear a more familiar jazz from Sun Ra and his players. Jack Jackson told me that Black folk had missed the boat on Sun Ra. Multi-generational struggle. The two songs that I heard most frequently during my childhood I hated then and detest to this day. One was the U.S. national anthem, a compulsory part of every school day. I can remember standing like a soldier, begrudgingly holding my limp hand over my chest while I soundlessly mouthed the words to what my little black ass understood as the opposing team's fight song. Eventually, I stopped mouthing the words. The other was a standard of the civil rights movement, and I must have heard it almost as much as that Star-Spangled Spasm. The last two words of the chorus rung in my ears as a mocking taunt launched in the face of a young boy's intuitive idealism. We shall overcome someday. Someday is an infinity when you're 9. The old folks who sang that drony, croaky rag of a tune always seemed to drag out those two words as if they were cursing me with the permanence of their oppression. Someday, they were saying, some infinitely distant day, we will finally get this cracker's foot off our neck and be able to live outside the shadow of white supremacy. Someday. I wouldn't have no part of someday then. I ain't going for it now. I think that if we are resolved to drain the fetid waters of racism and capitalism, we must do so immediately, but we must first stop repairing the levee. Most of us here are familiar with Michelle Alexander's excellent work detailing the use of the penal code to extend the reign of Jim Crow into contemporary Black life. Even before the recent spate of cop killings that have rightfully attracted so much media attention, she and Angela Davis were calling for a deep reimagining of law and order, crime and punishment. They are not calling for reform, sweeping or otherwise, of the institutional matrix that makes up the criminal justice system. They are calling for its abolition on the grounds that it has obviously done more harm than good. As we watch pictures of white middle-class smokers playfully enjoying their first tokes of legal pot, we are left to ponder, who is going to compensate the countless victims of cannabis prohibition? What apologies will be offered for the many lives, often of people of color, destroyed by the discredited premise that society has an interest in policing the neural synapses of its members? I gotta have the tea, just a throat thing. Excuse me. Sun Ra said, I have to be talking to people, but they will be changed. And everything they think is right, that will be nullified. And that's kind of hard, to come to a planet and nullify everything, but everything has to be nullified for them or else they're going to die. That's pretty clear. I don't think we can diminish the severity of the critique nestled in the Ra bomb. He is also very much like Alexander and Davis, not a nihilist, but an abolitionist. With childlike simplicity, Sun Ra's myth science offers an epistemological perch from which the absurdity of a planet-cannibalizing civilization is reduced to pun and punchline and therefore becomes a much more manageable crisis to confront. The new time that Sun Ra is publishing through the application of myth science is called Alter Destiny. His term for the ultimate zone of revolutionary and evolutionary possibilities. Alter Destiny negates manifest destiny and its diabolic exceptionalist plot to monetize all life on Earth. In fact, when the object of evolutionary adaptation shifts from macrophysiology and gross morphology to the symbolizing functions of the human brain, revolution and evolution collapse into a single ontogenetic dance. Sun Ra dictates that our only survivable future requires a science-truth inversion of tradition and so-called common sense, a world in which money and war have atrophied as cultural practice and human awareness has been released into new determinative potentials that are simply impossible to conceive of under the current reign of death. Once in altered destiny, we are not just doing new stuff, we are doing it with a new set of species-specific resources that erupt from our ability to construct many worlds from the microelectric chatter scattered between our peripheral and central nervous systems. Sun Ra taught us that words are crucially important in this cosmogenetic process. The world is languaged into place, and any sudden or precipitous change in language behavior might in fact end the world as we know it. Sun Ra said that such a collapse has already happened and wondered why we are obsessed with servicing the ruins of a dead civilization. Artists exist in a territory where language and behavior has to some extent been separated from some of the institutional normalizations that have corrupted discourse in so many other arenas. As an artist, I can be more extreme in my choice of what constitutes vocabulary and more improvisatory or original or synthetic in what constitutes grammar than I can be in any other area of social discourse. As such, Sun Ra saw a unique role for cultural workers in the type of stimulation that would lower the threshold for altered destiny. He also spoke very specifically about the unique position of Black people within American history and how that history uniquely serves the cause of post-humanity. Sun Ra liked to say that we should address our concerns to the Commerce Department because we were brought here as cargo, as property with property rights, not men and women with human rights. Indeed, the trajectory of Black ontology begins in reification as chattel and continues through 3/5 of a man for purposes of representational apportioning, then after several stages of second-class citizenry, has perhaps, of late, opened up to something like the status of full human being. That is, if Black life matters. But maybe we shouldn't be so quick to put on the brakes and settle for a human identity. After all, since we first applied for membership, the human condition has become a dangerous slum. Why stop there? Why shouldn't our long trajectory out of bondage generate enough momentum to throw us right past human into whatever lies beyond? Sun Ra invited us to join him in another order of being, to ascend into a post-humanity attainable through self-declaration. It's hard to see the kind of radical self-determination called for by myth science contained within any kind of ideological framework that sets nationalism as the highest order of human affiliation. When I first heard the expression Afro-futurism, I wasn't feeling it. And Afro-futurists seemed to be exactly what the segregationists and supremacists wanted, an Afro-future kind of over there someplace. It also was a term first coined by a white literary critic, and I bristled at the idea of any more definitions being slapped on Black ideas from outside. It was easy to soften to the term, however, because I almost always heard or read it in association with Sun Ra's name. More importantly, I was beginning to feel a real affinity for the kinds of questions that were being asked and the way they were being answered by the young people I met working under the Afro-futurist banner. I could appreciate, for instance, their need to challenge the reactionary tendencies that had crept into more old-line models of Black identity. I could also appreciate their openness to a world grown accustomed to bleeding boundaries and fertile hybridizations. Afrofuturism seemed really a lot like Afrocentrism reconfigured to better fit the current state of affairs, a world that has a lot more to say than just be Black. Sun Ra spoke of race in the vernacular of his time. I see no reason why we should follow suit in our time. The binary rhetoric of the white man versus the Black man doesn't translate well to the multi-hued polycultural realities of 21st century late capitalism. And we shouldn't indulge in reactionary speech just because it gives us some kind of nostalgic rush. I had a little Facebook thing going on with a friend of mine, a broadcast colleague actually. He had posted a picture of a white guy at a St. Louis Cardinals game who had altered his t-shirt with some lame message of support for the police officer who murdered Michael Brown. My friend had captioned his post, "This is how white people really feel." I had to respond because that was so contrary to my experience. Sure, there are plenty of white American citizens who side with their police in the ongoing war on black youth and black life. But between Michael Brown's bullet-riddled body laying in the August sun for 4 hours and Eric Garner's 11 cries for breath, I had white people crossing the street to tell me that that was some raw shit and that they were in no way down with it. I told my friend that he needed to hang out with a better class of white people. I meant that. Without drifting off into any unsustainable outsized optimism, I think it is undeniable that larger numbers of people than ever before have developed themselves beyond the basic contradictions that still divide most of us. This is a part of the evolutionary process, a part of the refreshing of time. If I ever was, I certainly am no longer a race-first kind of black man, but I'm still a black man. And to be crystal clear, I entertain no illusions of living in a post-racial America anytime soon. But I do think that if the most important thing about me is supposed to be my blackness, I must be a pretty boring person, and nobody wants to be that boring. Once the goal has been articulated, temporal migration into altered destiny, we have to form our associations and build our networks on the highest level of common aspiration, defined relative to the goal of exceeding human nature and building in a way that has never been attempted before. Abolitionist Ra. Sun Ra was pro-wealth and anti-money, and I have taken the cue from Sun Ra to act in a way that disrupts the myth of money. There are things we can do in the realm of tone science to obviate money, turn it off, make it all unspendable. I have written about money as a malignancy upon language, an alien parasite feeding on the holy body of the word. This parasitic tumor that is a strange chimera made from metaphor and math reduces to arithmetic all questions of value, and in the process of its metastasis, progressively corrupts all interhuman relations and every relation of the human being within the web of life that is our planetary home. In the same way that our sisters Angela and Michelle have stepped up to call for the abolition of every vestige of their criminal injustice system, I want to make it clear that I stand for and with any and all nonviolent efforts to make money go away, to remove it from our lives. If it is our destiny to translate science fiction into science fact, we must admit that even though the crew of the Starship Enterprise, they all had cell phones, wasn't no money in sight. Think about that. Money is already obsolete, and the economy of altered destiny is free of it in all its insidious forms. Afro-futurism returns black creativity to a world stage. It is secure enough in its identity to think and act now on an internationalist scale and soon on an intergalactic scale. We cannot project ourselves into altered destiny. There is a lot of probability at play here. But what Sun Ra achieves with the inculcation of doubt exceeds what religion can accomplish with the cultivation of faith. His effect is to dissolve the tethers of compliance and belief that hold the human being and the wax wings of civilization together in a death spiral towards oblivion. Ra was the coded energy of the external, our ticket out of the shooting gallery called America. He was, through the accident of his particular biography and his unique qualities of character, the perfect pioneer to venture outside the spaceship of human history, observe the gaping hole in the side of the vessel, and return to declare to those of us waiting inside, no wonder this thing can't fly, and it ain't never gonna fly again. You cannot have an honest discussion of Sun Ra and subordinate his ideas to any other agenda or ideological system. He was his own grand order, a complete cosmology of discipline and myth. Similarly, any political orientation that can be credibly attached to Sun Ra must conform to the basic tenets of his heliocentric approach, even if you find these to be quite general or minimal or less than specific. Sun Ra, for instance, spoke of precision discipline as a compound term that described one of his highest beliefs, that we are all supposed to be getting better at something through repeated effort all the time. In Message to Love, Jimi Hendrix said it a little differently. He sung, "Find yourself first and then your talent. Work hard in your mind, for it could come alive. A Sun Ra political transformation has no place for persons who are not using precision discipline to perfect themselves. That is, in a Sun Ra revolution, mediocrity is not an option. For Sun Ra, feelings were fundamental. Everything we think we know of a world beyond the self is an inference based on affective states arising and rooted within the embodied self. This is obviously a Kantian idea that fits Sun Ra's emphasis on the primacy of intuition rather snugly. A Sun Ra political axis must be centered on the intrinsic value of subjective experience. Sun Ra's religious views are murky, maybe quirky, but it seems unlikely that he had any loyalty to any recognizable faith community. He casually spoke of God as one might speak of a neighbor that doesn't mow their grass, of a peer, of a colleague. Sun Ra was never a particularly reverent or pious man. The one exception are two songs Sun Ra wrote praising nature's God, and we can infer from their lyrics and Sun Ra's other statements about the natural world that he believed our future survival depends on healing, repairing, and restoring our relationship with our home planet. Mathematician and theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking believes that interstellar travel and the colonization of other worlds become necessary as humanity exhausts the Earth's capacity to sustain life. Sun Ra's position might be seen as a reversal or inversion of Hawking. That is, humanity only proves itself worthy of interstellar travel, including visiting other planets, by restoring the ecological integrity of this one. I know Professor Hawking is supposed to be a very smart man, but who does he think is running this situation? Do you really think you get to trash this world and move on to the next one like the galaxy's planets are a damn bowl of M&Ms? How dare you presume to export the trademark Yankee Doodle piratology of pillage and plunder to distant star systems? Any Sun Ra-inspired movement must necessarily be as green as it is black. And we shouldn't be surprised, should we, to find that eco-racism tends to place the most threatening environmental hazards as close as possible to where black people live. Our survival is dependent on reinserting the rhythm of human affairs into the complex polyrhythms of nature. Our physical, mental, spiritual, and interpersonal health are all ultimately dependent on our humble participation within this larger music. We're either the last generation to live in alienation from Mother Earth, or we're the last generation. I made it a point in my book to try and paint a picture of a primal time, a time before exile from Eden. The obvious utility of Eden as an enduring archetype is its retention of the memory of an equilibrium between human and non-human histories. When the Ra bomb goes off, and by now you've probably figured out that this book, this lecture, and you are all critical components of its fuse, most of us should already be existing in a charged, hyper-creative state, a condition that is impossible to fully rise to or sustain under the ceiling of these grimy old institutions with their sagging pillars and faded conceits. And here we come to understand that space is the place is a powerful, critical interrogation of the concept of sovereignty and a direct challenge to its authority. Space is the place. The most recognizable of Sun Ra's many signature space chants is his reminder of what must be done if you need to construct a house and there's already a building standing on the lot. You better make some space. All the churches have to shut their doors. All the governments got to turn their thing over to this force which can lead the planet properly, Sun Ra calmly observed. They have to do it or die. Now that's my message. Sun Ra was an abolitionist. On May 23rd, 1968, writer Henry Dumas had just left a Sun Ra rehearsal and was waiting at the subway station on 135th Street when he was approached by a white New York City transit cop. Dumas was a good friend of Sun Ra. Sonny called him Hank. Both men had an appreciation for alternate epistemologies and the folk wisdom of their Southern heritage. Beginning in the mid-60s, Dumas, a self-described disciple of Sonny, spent a great deal of time around Ra and his music. Dumas believed that his surrealist, lyrically vernacular short stories and poetry were building a literary counterpart to Ra's great mission of myth and transformation. The cop who approached Dumas on the platform might have mistaken him for someone else. Some words were exchanged. One or more shots were fired. And in a scene that is jarringly familiar, a white cop walked away from a lifeless black body. He was a teacher, a father, a gifted artist and intellectual. He was Sun Ra's friend, and he was murdered while waiting on the train. He was 33 years old. Scholar Nathan Regain, in an article published in the fall 2012 issue of Criticism, looks carefully at the synergistic relationship between Dumas and Sun Ra through the prism of language, nature, and collectivity. Early in his essay, our attention is drawn to a story called Metagenesis, which seems to offer a parallel literary construction of the Sun Ra myth. In Dumas's story, the quasi-fictional character Sun Ra, spelled with no space between Sun and a lowercase Ra, leads a parade not unlike the one that the real Sun Ra had led across 125th Street to usher in the era of black arts. The parade in Metagenesis is itself a trigger, a detonator, for an evolutionary cascade that leaves no mind or institution untoppled. At the conclusion of the story, a single musical sound, perhaps something like one of Sonny's famous space chords, completes this metamorphosis. And as Dumas writes, all over the land, from north to south, the painted people, too hot to get near now, begin to march. Machines died in the air. An electric power plant reversed its power, and the plant electrocuted and melted everything in range of it for 10 miles. The ice mountain melted, and the freeze lines dissolved. Icelands faded, and panic went through Wolfpack. But it was too late. Sun Ra took panic itself and drove it into them. I loved my friend Jack Jackson, but I don't really think black people missed the boat. We're just a little late, like 30 or 40 years. But now the painted people have gathered in a mighty multitude, and we are about to make some space because we have building to do. Space is the place. Thank you very much. I want to take questions, if questions are appropriate. I don't know how much time, but I'm sure the organizers will move us forward. Any questions? I left you with no questions. Is that Mama Khadija sitting in the back row? Peace, Mama. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll talk later. All right. Baba. Oh, Nathan Regain. He used to be at the University of Virginia. I don't know where he is now. Regain, and I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm not sure. Do you know him? It's a good piece. It's a good piece. Questions? Oh, come on. Responses? Ma'am.
Is there anything you wish Sun Ra had spoken to or made a little more clarity about?
No. No. He was crystal clear. Wow, my little talk doesn't merit any questions. I feel all net. Yes, yes.
Myself, I'm a revolutionary communist, and I'm here because I see the intersection of what Sun Ra was trying to do in terms of, and I think something that you said, sort of shatter old belief systems, open up imagination, let people's imagination and thinking soar, and doing that through music. I see the intersection of that and the importance of that in terms of us breaking out of the box of this system, this capitalist system, is the best we can do, and it's the only game in town. And I think to envision a world that's fit for human beings, especially when, you know, all the revolutions of the past and any time people experimented with that has been ruled out of order. I think for people to go forward, I agree that humanity is stalled, and I think to go forward is going to take a lot of imagination. But I do feel very strongly that it is going to take actual revolution. That the thing you
What is actual revolution?
Well, where a system is actually overthrown and replaced with another one.
A system is a system is a set of functionally related parts. Yes.
Right, but
Right.
it has
So is a species, right?
but it has a state, and that would have to be overthrown, because when people want to change the world, even in cultural ways.
Sister, what I'm going to say is going to maybe be not quite what you wanted to hear, the way you wanted to hear it. But yeah, I agree with you. There are no states in Altered Destiny, but that's one of the smaller changes we're going to deal with. That's one of the smaller changes. No states, no governments, no money, no war, no capitalism. I talk about money as a cancer, but I also like to talk about it as a form of music. When I see a young person, 21, 22, 23, ringing a cash register, you see someone gainfully employed. I see someone lost in a grotesque and obscene dance, funneling wealth to someone that they'll never meet. This is a horrible system. This is an atrocious way to live. You're going to hear from Marvin X later this afternoon. And it was really one of the most illuminating interviews that went into developing the book. And Marvin, you said something that was really profound for me, and I keep coming back to it. And I think there's two ways to interpret it. And my way is maybe, you know, not the first choice. Sun Ra said, and I got this through Marvin, I'd never heard it before. Sun Ra said that everything that has come since ancient Egypt is basically another version of ancient Egypt. We know, if we studied a little bit, we know that Christianity is the Osirian myth, just with new names, and, you know, it's the same myth. Now, basically, here's the question. If the Egyptians, and that's an old project, we love them, but they're gone. They built big things out of stuff. That's what they did. They built big things out of stuff. Maybe that whole era of building big things, whether it's big buildings, big economies, big institutions, maybe that's all over. I think Altered Destiny is a noetic revolution. I think Altered Destiny is a way of human consciousness existing in the world that, and this really wouldn't, like the Sun Ra purists don't like this, but it's more like an altered state of consciousness than anything. It's more like an altered state of consciousness. You can push yourself by listening to Sun Ra and his music into a state that is somewhere between cannabis and DMT. I mean, you just won't see the world the way you used to see it if you get enough Sun Ra on you. And if you still see the world the way you've been seeing it, I would suggest that you rub a little more Sun Ra on you. You need some more. You didn't take enough. You didn't take enough. And I think that nonviolence, and I couch everything, the most extreme militant response to these warmongers and these money mongers, but always nonviolently, not because I'm Martin King or Gandhi, but I think it's the way to win. Because you are dealing with a system that is the author of violence. How are you going to beat somebody at their own game? You 4'3" and you trying to play, you know, basketball with Dwight Howard. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. You got to come up with something else that will work. So we beat them by a kind of anarchy that happens here first, sister, my communist friend. How do you use pronouns? We, right? Collective pronouns. We. We are all in this room. That's a fact, right? That's just a logical fact. I've never been an American in my mind and heart. I don't know why. You understand? I want you to hear that, brothers. The way you hear your gay friend telling you that he's never been attracted to women. You're just like, what? What do you mean? I want you to hear it the same way. I've never used, you will never. You wake me up in the middle of a deep sleep and ask me about my government, I'll tell you I ain't got a government. My troops were locked up, shot up, and driven into exile. We lost that war. Matula Shakur, I talked to him on a telephone when he was in Leavenworth. We lost that war. Those are good brothers and sisters. We didn't back them up. We can't fight that strategy anymore. It won't work. It's a fantasy. So now we achieve an anarchy in the heart. We say, in here, I'm no longer anything but a beautiful human being, a spirit. I'm not even human. I'm just a spirit on a journey in this shell, this vessel. And where can I find something positive to happen with these other spirits? Be an anarchist here, and then see what happens. They're done. They're through. They're over. Baba.
Bugging me for an interview some time ago. I don't know how long ago was that before your book came out. But for many months you called me and talked to me, and I didn't know you was a fake or not. But I recall the conversations, and I do recall, I think I told you about what Sonny said when he went to Egypt. He said they told him, this is your land. This is not our land. All this here is yours. And so Sunrise gave me that term. He said, we are the latter-day Egyptian revisionists. That's who we are. So in terms of space, space is the place, and the connection between the political. There's a Black Panther documentary that just came out, directed by Stanley Nelson. And the most significant comment in that documentary, and the director spoke on it at the San Francisco International Film Festival, and when we saw the brothers say it, and it was about the shootout in LA. And this brother said, when they were in that building shooting back at the police, that was the freest he had ever been in his life. And he knew he was the king of his space at that moment. And he owned his space. And if they wanted to invade his space, then bring their ass on up in there. And he survived. He survived. So space is the place.
Space is the place.
Okay, hi. Your talk was really rich, and but there's one thing I wanted to sort of hear a little bit more of, to the question of what maybe what I like to hear more about in thinking about Sun Ra is connecting space and time. When you talk about the hearing, we shall overcome someday, and the stretch out over, that really struck me. And it also struck me because something that I struggle with is this notion of time. And it was, and you kind of in some ways helped articulate this difficulty that I had at first in sort of integrating the idea or the concept of Afrofuturism. Because to me, it was about this distance as opposed to an immediacy. And I think like in meditation a lot, you know, we think about the now. But more than that, I think about a conversation I had with my great aunt many years ago, when I hadn't been to Louisiana, where my family is from, for a while. And I saw her, and she said, when are you going to come and really spend some time? And I said, maybe a year from now. And she mocked me. She laughed, and she mocked me. She said, are you crazy? Are you out of your mind? A year? So for me, a year was 365 days. But for her, a year was something very different. And of course, you can imagine that she died within that year. Before I would see her again. So something I really want to hear more from you, because I think there's so much more to say, is your hearing as a young boy someday stretched out, and then this other piece.
Gradualism, you know. The history, the value of your life is you live through history, and then you get these epiphanies, as you hold up what you experienced to the official version, okay, the official version. And what I don't hear people talking about when they do their little Selma retroflections is how big the word integration was in that time period. That was defined on the general stage. That was defined as the goal. The goal was we got to integrate these black people. They're going to burn up all the cities. Now, the debate wasn't so much between the segregationists that wanted to stand in the door with an axe handle. That guy, by the time I was coming along, and conscious as a child, that guy had already been marginalized as a dinosaur, as a relic. But the real debate was between people who were like, we want our freedom now, and people who were like, oh, you'll get it, but, don't be so pushy. Gradualism. We shall overcome someday. Jesus is coming. When? Well, he can't tell you. It's just too religious for me. It's just too religious for me. I love my kids. The way that we live is abominable. It should end now. To me, and we have a difference here, the easiest way to accomplish that is to get the largest number of people to opt out of the mental participation, the faith that makes their institutions really run. We give them their power. We give them their power when we salute their flag, pay our taxes. They're going to look up. Really, this is the way it's going to go down, because this is the way that the Mayan elite lost their, peasantry. They're going to look up and give an order and look over the shoulder, and there's not going to be anybody there. Do you understand? I want it for you. I want it for your children. I want it for all of us and our kids. Because culture, we start to, we get so infatuated, because culture, struggle is a good feeling. Fighting is a good feeling, Marvin. It's a good feeling for a day, for a week, for a month. Syrian war, they're saying, man, it could go on for 3 or 4 more years, back and forth. Fighting's a good feeling for a minute, but I don't want to fight forever. I want to enjoy the fruits of victory. I want a plan that says, okay, this is how we dismantle this joker, and then we'll build something else in its place. This isn't empty idealism any more than this man was talking empty idealism. This is the way that it's going to work.
Hello, enjoyed the presentation. Like Henry Dumas, I'm from Arkansas. As a matter of fact, I'm on the board of the Henry Dumas Foundation along with his wife. And
ooh, I'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, and Eugene Redmond.
Oh,
Tell us a little bit more about that relationship of those two, because we would love to know about it with the foundation.
Look, I'm really not an expert on their relationship. Right. I know that there's a recording where you have Dumas interviewing Sun Ra, and Sun Ra giving some really interesting insights on how he views black struggle at that time. During the course of that interview, he tells Dumas that he had actually given Malcolm X some books, but had the impression that Malcolm was too busy to take the time to read them, which I thought was pretty interesting. I can't speak authoritatively, except that I think that's a really fertile area that needs to be explored more. The idea that Dumas would take Sun Ra's myth and then remyth it, that's just deep to me, man. That's just too deep. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.